I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
President Biden today calling the protests in Cuba remarkable and unprecedented.
The United States has denied Cuba's accusation that it is to blame for an extraordinary wave of protest.
Now to the ongoing turmoil in Cuba and Haiti.
Over the last few weeks, domestic crises have gripped the Caribbean nations of Haiti and Cuba. In Haiti, a team of highly trained assassins murdered Haitian President Jovenel Moïse at his residence. Meanwhile, in Cuba, thousands of protesters have taken to the streets to demonstrate against the post-Castro communist regime and the dire economic situation on the island. This week, I'm joined by Elise Labott, a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. We'll unpack the recent assassination and turmoil in Haiti and the unprecedented protests that have rocked Cuba. Here we go. Elise, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Doug.
So before we dive into the two topics at hand today, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a columnist, as you said, with Foreign Policy magazine. Before that, I was a CNN Global Affairs correspondent. I was with the network for about 18 years and covered 7 secretaries of state, traveling the world and interviewing and meeting a lot of world leaders. So really kind of, foreign policy wonk, as they say in our world, and glad to be discussing some of these issues with you today.
You're in the right place to be a foreign policy wonk on The World Unpacked, so we're glad you're here. A few weeks ago, on July 11th, we saw the Cubans take to the streets in massive historic protests against the government. So what was so unprecedented about these protests?
Well, I think what it really was first of all, for the first time, I think it's been much more kind of spontaneous. There wasn't any organization to it. It just kind of erupted around the world. Like they started in some of the poorer cities where, there aren't kind of, a lot of people in the bigger cities like Havana are able to rent out their place for a restaurant, or they're able to get some money from families, remittances from the United States. These are really poor people where it started. And obviously the lack of tourism because of COVID really exacerbated what is going on in Cuba in terms of poverty. COVID has hit them really hard. And Cubans are finally kind of speaking out in terms of, they're saying, freedom, down with the dictator. But I think what they're really protesting is their just frustration with their poverty and their, lack of resources. They want a better life for themselves. And finally are saying enough.
It's been reported that young people, particularly Afro-Cubans, are some of the leaders in the protest, which marks a big change from previous eras of Cuban protests and resistance. In fact, the symbol of the movement is the phrase Patria y Vida, which is a play on the communist slogan Patria o Muerte, and is drawn from a hugely popular rap song by Gente de Zona and other artists. What does the changing nature of the protesters tell you about the protests and the trajectory of the country?
Well, I think that, as you said, I think older people who have grown up during the revolution were used to kind of living this way. And even for them, it's bad, people waiting for 8 hours in line for a piece of bread. And I think the older generation just got used to living for those hardships, and they don't know anything else. But young people are really clear that either they're going to fight for their rights, or it's, really a lost generation. We talk about young people being the future, and young people kind of around the world right now, and particularly here in the United States. But I think in Cuba, to see these young people, and what they're saying is, I have no fear. And I think that's what's different.
So we talked a little bit about, folks getting arrested. And I'm curious, how did the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, and his government react to the protests?
Well, at first he called them counter-revolutionaries, right? And then he said that they're, the United States is in charge of the protest. And then they said that the CIA, they're looking for an enemy. They're desperate to blame someone. And they were protesting, arresting a lot of people on the streets. They've gone house by house detaining people. There was a few, last week, the president kind of recognized that when these protests erupted and kind of, spread across the country, I think the president realized that he had to do something. And he acknowledged that a lot of his hardships have to do with the government leadership. He didn't take personal responsibility, but he recognized that, the people are suffering, and he loosened some of the restrictions on, people allowed to bring in goods and medical supplies and remittances. We'll see how long that lasts. But I think he wanted to let some steam out of the pot and at least improve the situation for some people.
So you talked about him blaming the United States, and in particular, I think besides the CIA and others, he's also talked about the U.S. embargo. Do you think this is a fair criticism, that it's having a big impact, or is it just kind of another propaganda statement to say, oh, it's the U.S. embargo that's the problem?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's no doubt that the Cubans have suffered from the embargo. But one of the reasons that, Cubans have such a hard life and is shortages caused by, the socialist system, by the regime. There are some benefits to the socialist system in terms of Cubans all have a pretty decent medical system, COVID notwithstanding. And the U.S. economic sanctions have brought hardships, but I think it's also an unproductive economic system imposed by the leadership. There are a lot of exports into Cuba in terms of food and agricultural commodities. But what U.S. sanctions prohibit is tourism to the island. So I think, and there's a reason for that, because, who benefits from a lot of the tourism? The regime does. And so at the same time, I think, the sanctions have really hurt the Cuban people, but I think the regime has hurt them more. And so the question for the United States then is, do we want to help the Cuban people and overlook the fact that the regime may benefit as well, with the long-term hope that opens the country? Or do we continue to squeeze the regime, which is really only going to hurt economic hardships for the Cuban people?
One thing that has become clear is how important the internet is for everyday Cubans and for this protest movement. And we're sitting in the United States having hearings about how the internet may have enabled us to damage our own democracy. But on their island, the internet and its availability is just vital for these protesters. Can you talk a little bit about that? Does the Cuban government think of the internet as a threat to their regime? And is there a way that the United States is thinking about providing more internet to average Cubans?
Well, certainly the regime sees the internet as a threat. If you saw during the protests, the regime turned off a lot of the internet. And one of the reasons I think that the protests spread so quickly is because people saw, videos of protests across the country, all across the nation. And that was part of the whole idea, that no one had any fear anymore, because they saw everyone else out in the streets. And that's why, the government definitely saw the internet as a threat. And kind of turned off a lot of the social media that the Cubans were using to organize. Now, yes, I think I've argued that the U.S. should definitely help get internet back on and into the country, and could really help the people. But it's not going to be as easy as that.
So let's talk a little bit about the U.S. policy to Cuba. Let's start with President Biden. He campaigned on changing course from Trump's hardline Cuba policy that Trump reinstated after President Obama sought an opening with Cuba.
We also need a new Cuba policy. The administration's approach is not working.
6 months into the Biden administration, what does President Biden's Cuba policy look like?
I mean, it looks very much like the Trump administration does. President Biden did say during the campaign that he pledged to reverse Trump's hawkish sanction-led policy, saying the crackdown on Cubans by the regime has gotten worse under Trump, not better. But we just celebrated a half year or commemorated a half year into his administration. And, like a lot of other policies, they're effectively a continuation of Trump's. President Biden has said that he supports democracy in Cuba and put some sanctions on some officials that were involved in the crackdown. But what I've said is that, yes, the Cuban people are calling for freedom, but they're also protesting their lack of food. We've seen across the world how democratic movements ultimately, have a tendency to prevail. Obviously, in countries like Syria or such, they haven't. But there is going to be a day when this regime will fall. The current president is not as charismatic or powerful as the Castros were. And so it's unclear whether he can withstand this current wave of protest. And I think the administration wants to help shape what comes next. I don't necessarily think that that means military intervention. But I think it needs to be there and be seen to the Cuban people as it wants to help them. We see today that Russia is sending vaccines to Cuba right now. The U.S. needs to get in there and be seen as someone who's helping Cubans move towards the future, not stuck in the past in the embargo.
You mentioned in a great piece you wrote for Foreign Policy that we'll put in the show notes about how important the U.S. policy on Cuba is for the broader region. Can you just talk a little bit about how important it is that President Biden get the Cuba policy right and what that would mean for the broader region of Latin America?
I mean, look, President Biden says he supports democracy, and he's kind of dividing the world into this existential battle between democracies and authoritarian regimes. And I know it's very crowd-pleasing and very popular to promote democracy in Cuba, but let's be honest, it's a little bit difficult. We're facing a real democratic crisis here. And I think the more vocal the administration becomes, the higher the cost of inaction will come, and like I said, there is a definite movement left in the region. And the U.S. policy towards Cuba is not hurting that helping that at all.
So there's a U.S. domestic political component to this issue, given the huge number of Cubans living in the United States and in Florida in particular, which is vital for electoral politics here. Can you walk us through how the protests in Cuba have spilled into U.S. domestic politics?
Yes. I mean, look, the whole policy towards Cuba is always politically charged. And even more so is, you see Cuban Americans in Florida taking to the streets in solidarity with the protesters. And, you have Republican leaders like Senator Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. Both of those senators played a major role in the hardline policy of President Trump towards Cuba, criticizing him at every turn. And don't forget, President Biden is also trying to placate Democratic Senator Robert Menendez. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's one of the major and really lone voices of opposition returning to, President Obama era of opening towards Cuba. And he needs Senator Menendez for a lot of things, not only confirming all of his nominees in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, supporting his domestic agenda. And, the Biden administration has stuck to this, kind of middle ground of talking about support for democracy and human rights. Obviously, everybody has a idea of how that should go, but clearly President Biden is thinking towards the midterm elections in 2022, and states like Florida. You've seen some protests against at the White House calling for reopening Cuban Americans who are in favor of a reopening towards Cuba. So clearly, a very politically charged policy is becoming even more fraught for President Biden, given the protests.
So for now, the Cuba protests seem to have ebbed, whether it's because the president's efforts to placate them have been effective or because of the oppressive tactics against the protesters themselves. What can we expect next in Cuba?
I mean, it remains to be seen whether these protests will be quashed by the government or they're going to represent a larger movement that could ultimately see the end of the dictatorship. I think we don't know yet. I think the government in Cuba is going to try to, as we said, ease up on some of the hardships by allowing more money to come in, allowing, loosening the restrictions on imports into the country by private citizens. And I think it's all going to rest on addressing the acute humanitarian hardships that drove them into the streets. The U.S. needs to, renew some of the things that made life a little bit better for Cubans. Look, let's be honest. The whole idea of the opening was never that the regime was going to change its stripes, right? It was about whether allowing Cubans to have more access to information, to have more American travelers going down to the island, having more interaction with the rest of North America would open up the country to the extent that the regime would be forced to open up a little bit. Not that it was going to be some kind of magic bullet, but the United States can kind of sit on the sidelines and sanction its way out of this. I think it's going to have to take a more active approach.
When we come back, I'll ask Elise all about the unfolding crisis in Haiti. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Shocking news, the president of Haiti murdered in his sleep. In the days that followed, it's been a dizzying array of headlines, twists, and turns. The biggest, perhaps, that America...
Okay, Elise, let's talk about Haiti. Can you give us the basics about Haitian politics and President Moïse?
Well, it's interesting. President Moïse was really unknown before he came to office. He was this little-known banana exporter. He called himself the Banana Man, and that's where all of his ads called himself the Banana Man. He was the hand-picked successor to President Michel Martelly, a one-time popular singer who became president in 2011. He was accused of widespread corruption and mismanaging funds during the earthquake and all of the reconstruction money of the devastating earthquake that really flattened much of Haiti in 2010. And he handpicked Moïse as a bid. That bid for power was really marred from the beginning. Even his campaign was accused of fraud and corruption. So over the next couple of years, he, showed himself to have some authoritarian tendencies of his own. He used control of the judicial system to dismiss charges against him, undermine his opposition. And the result of that was an increasingly paralyzed government that by 2020 was completely gridlocked, just as COVID was coming. And so then there was this disagreement with the opposition about when his presidential term should start. Now, because of all this, tribunal and election investigation, he took office a year later. And he thought that somehow entitled him to stay for an extra year. And there was obviously widespread opposition to that. And during that time, he didn't hold one election. So, there was no local elections. There was no parliament. There was nothing. And as the crisis dragged on, he just basically began to govern by decrees and, further undermining his government legitimacy. There's been a lot of charges that he was close to some of the gangs in the country, which have really run rampant through the country and responsible for a lot of the political gridlock and violence. And his assassination is stoking further fear and confusion about the future.
The assassination itself is almost unbelievable. Essentially, a number of commandos, many of whom aren't Haitian, sort of showed up at his residence, either overran or bribed his security guards to look the other way. It's really an unbelievable story. Can you tell us what we know so far about the assassins and about who may have ordered the assassination?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's really like a whodunit, right? I mean, he was shot several times on July 7th in his residence. His wife was also seriously injured. At least 26 people have been arrested, including 18 former Colombian soldiers. There are still some other suspects that they're looking for, including a former rebel leader, an ex-Haitian senator, a Haitian Superior Court judge. But what's really interesting in the investigation is that, some people very close to the president were arrested. A top official who served as a general security coordinator, 2 Americans, including at the center of the plot, this guy named Dr. Christian Emmanuel Sanon. He's a 63-year-old doctor with ties to Florida, and he was supposedly going to be the new prime minister, or new president rather, after the president was killed.
Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about Haiti's history, because you don't get to this point where the country is in such bad shape, the politics is so troubled, without some prior events leading to that point. So it's always been a troubled country, or some have called it a fragile state. How did we get here?
Oh, well, I mean, look, for 30 years, they've been, under dictatorships, right? So first you had Francois Duvalier. He was Papa Doc. And then his son, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier. That was, Haiti struggled to just continue to emerge from cycles of dictatorships and coups that keeps the country impoverished and struggling. After the, kind of Papa Doc and Baby Doc, then you had Jean-Betran Aristide. He was the first democratically elected president in 1990. He was deposed in a coup. President Clinton returned him to power in 94 with the help of thousands of American troops. And he was reelected, but forced out, by the international community. And then you had, Martelly, who was seen as someone who was going to bring, the country past the earthquake. He did not. And I think what happened was, a lot of the money comes in, especially during the earthquake. There was this hope that it would set Haiti on a new path and shore up and, resuscitate the battered infrastructure and start fresh by shoring up the government's capacity.
You mentioned the money. The New York Times reported that it was actually as much as $13 billion in international aid to Haiti since the devastating earthquake in 2010. What happened to that money?
Well, look, Martelly was accused of widespread corruption and mismanaging the funds, the reconstruction funds. But, the money was really, hoped to set Haiti on a new path. But really, the idea was that the money was not used by Haitians. The international community, just kind of ran the show and never really helped Haiti develop its own capacity, develop its own methods of government, and really either embezzled or wasted, and basically that's what kind of never really helped the country recover economically. So you had this persistent economic malaise, rising crime, corruption, and that's really has led to just this continued cycle of violence.
Of that money that flowed in, the United States contributed something on the order of $2.5 billion. You also mentioned that we've had more than one military intervention in Haiti in recent years, recent decades. How much responsibility does the United States have for the state of affairs in Haiti today? Is this our fault?
I don't know that it's necessarily the U.S. fault, but certainly the U.S. Way that the U.S. dealt with Haiti contributed to the situation. There's never been a shortage of money, as we've been talking about. But why did the aid only compound Haiti's troubles? Because the one thing that the world and the U.S. in particular never taught Haiti to do was govern. And the reconstruction never went beyond rebuilding the country's damaged infrastructure to help the governance. And so I think that what the U.S. did was set up this system of kind of codependency, where you're spending, as you said, $2.3 billion Less than 3% of that money went directly to Haitian organizations and firms. Most of it ended up with U.S. companies, most of them around Washington, right?
When Haiti's former acting prime minister, Claude Joseph, called on the United States to send in troops, Biden said that sending American soldiers was not on the table at this moment. So I guess he's leaving the door open for a future intervention. Are there any circumstances where Biden, who's in the midst of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, would consider sending U.S. troops to Haiti? And if not, what does a reasonable and responsible U.S. policy in Haiti look like?
I don't think so. I mean, don't forget, President Biden campaigned on, reducing the U.S. military footprint. I mean, there could be like a short-term kind of stabilization, particularly for the embassy if needed. But I think what the U.S. right now is saying that it wants to help get these, various political factions together to find some kind of accommodation where they can then, make the country more safe and more democratic, and kind of realizing that not only is money no substitute for leadership, but military action is from the outside is no substitute for leadership. I mean, I think that what the U.S. really needs to do is, really help build up Haitian civil society at the center and strengthen the country's fragile government and institutions. I mean, I don't think there's anybody except maybe, some Haitians that, the prime minister, as you said, don't necessarily think that a U.S. intervention is needed. Certainly not in Cuba and certainly not in Haiti. I mean, I think that what's needed here is not nation building, but state building. Is enhancing the ability of the state to govern itself.
So we're in the aftermath of the assassination, and Prime Minister Joseph has stepped aside. He's handed power to Ariel Henry. September elections are being called for, but it seems unlikely with COVID and with all the instability and gang violence in Haiti. What's next for Haiti? Where do they go from here?
Well, there definitely needs to be some kind of accommodation to encourage open and constructive dialogue to reach a political accord. But what Haiti really needs, as much as they need money, as much as they need vaccines, this is the one country that doesn't have any vaccines for its people. I think what Haiti needs is patient diplomacy to bring together the different factions to move towards elections and select a president. The country is rife with violence, rife with crime, rife with gang rule right now. Right now, the gangs are really, ruling the show, and there's a huge political vacuum. But, I know, as we've discussed, is a call for intervention to hold elections. That's only going to deepen the dependency that made Haiti so corrupt and violent, and also in stark contrast to what President Biden has said in terms of curtailing U.S. overseas. So I think Haiti is in for, continues to be headed for a very rocky road. But again, what's really needed is that patient U.S. diplomacy to try and help Haiti stand up for itself.
Elise Labott, columnist for Foreign Policy Magazine, thank you so much for joining us to unpack what's going on in Cuba and in Haiti.
My pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.